Okay, welcome. So I read Lloyd Bitzer, the Rhetorical Situation, published in 1968. Kind of a big deal. This actually gets taught in our AP language class to our juniors, AP juniors. So I'm going to keep this short because I just did one and it was 22 minutes long. So I'm going to shrink it down. So basically, Bitzer gets into his concept of the rhetorical situation. And he kind of goes against the idea that rhetoric makes a rhetorical address makes a rhetorical situation. He's going to argue that it's the rhetorical situation that leads to the rhetoric, or that makes the rhetoric. And the key word here is kind of exigence. This need, this need for utterance. This situation will arrive that kind of demands rhetoric. Whether that rhetoric or this discourse kind of happens, it doesn't matter. The situation is rhetorical when it demands rhetoric. And I'll get more into that. And let's scroll. So you're asking yourself, what is a rhetorical situation? So basically, I'm going to jump around and highlight some key quotes, and we'll kind of move. I'll also share this PDF if people want to look at it. So really, I want to get down here. Kind of one point that's important. I kind of touch on this idea that rhetorical address, it does not create the situation. On the contrary, it's the situation which kind of calls for the discourse, which calls for the rhetoric. So although a rhetorical address kind of is a reliable sign that, yes, this is a situation of rhetoric, that doesn't mean that only situations with rhetorical addresses are rhetorical situations. It's actually kind of, he's flipping it. So let's jump down. So here it kind of just talks about it's the context that's really important. And again, he's making these same ideas here. The situation kind of demands the rhetoric, and thus it is a rhetorical situation because it's demanding that rhetoric. Really here, I think he makes a good point, or does a good job of describing rhetoric. Rhetoric alters kind of reality. It demands a change. That's why we use rhetoric. So you're using discourse to affect some type of change in reality. And that's what the rhetorical situation is calling for. Again, here, this blue, the blue highlights are just kind of examples that he uses. Here he uses this tribe that went fishing, and there are all these physical things they're doing. They need to haul the nets. They need to kind of let go of the nets, pull in, move all these different objects. And the physical parts are important. But the argument he makes is, well, this is a rhetorical situation because you have the guy saying, pull in, let go, shift further, lift the net. This is all rhetoric. It's affecting change. And he's going to say down here that the verbal responses are actually as important as the physical responses. This is a rhetorical situation. You need someone to pull up the net. It demands rhetoric on your part. You need to use discourse to kind of change directions. Yeah. And here in my nice kind of color-coded Christmas theme, I'm going to kind of jump through these, but he's going to kind of get into, well, what does all this mean? So one, rhetorical discourse comes into existence as a response to a situation. So the situation demands that response, specifically a discourse, thus it's rhetorical. And it's given significance by the situation. So again, it's that idea that it's all kind of contextual. And right here makes a good point, or I guess one of the crucial points that he makes is a necessary condition of rhetorical discourse is the rhetorical situation. Otherwise, it's not rhetorical discourse. Just like an answer is not an answer if there's no question. That's just words or statement of fact. And this idea that, well, guess what? Like some rhetorical situations, they mature or they decay. Every situation does not lead to a response. It demands a response, but that response won't always happen. And that situation might pass. It's happened where, oh, there's a situation we want to affect some type of change. We're like, oh, but we don't say anything. That moment passes. And again, this is more just the idea that the discourse fits the situation. And the three kind of key points here are going to be exigence, audience, constraints. Exigence is that need, that urgency, that need for utterance. There's some type of imperfection. It requires the rhetoric. What's important is if you can't make change, if you can't affect change, it's not rhetorical, or it's not a rhetorical situation. You can't, yelling at a storm is not rhetoric. That storm's not going to stop. Same idea that if there's an exigence, but only a physical action will affect change and not discourse, then it's not rhetorical. So again, it's only when you have it's a rhetorical situation when that exigence demands discourse or rhetoric that can affect some type of change. And he uses a couple examples here of, we have issues with pollution, so you kind of use rhetoric to affect change. You want people to stop polluting. An attorney appealing to the court. Again, there's more affecting change. And audience, we get audience, like we've gone over that. But the one little thing he talks about, the one tweak, I guess, or unique take, is that specifically rhetorical audience is one that can be influenced and can be mediators of change. So if I preach about pollution to a room full of toddlers, that's not a rhetorical situation. That's not a rhetorical audience. I can't actually affect any change through them, and thus not a rhetorical situation. And then constraints are kind of all the things that constrain the decision, the action, the situation. I found a nice example by this professor, Susan Smith in Arizona University, or the University of Arizona, when I was looking for this PDF online. And she used the example of nice little kind of sheet that she made. Let's say the exigence is an itch. You have an itch, you want to scratch it. It demands that scratch. Well, then you need the scratchers. Those are your audience. They can affect change. The people who are close to you, they can itch you. Kind of a constraint in that case would be like the glove. Someone has gloves, that's going to affect how they act. But in a more kind of conceptual idea, it can be people's beliefs, their attitudes, your own personal character, the person speaking, kind of logical proofs, evidence that you're using. These are all going to constrain the situation in some way. And ultimately, it's these three things that lead to a rhetorical situation. And basically, he will lay out everything, and he kind of repeats some of the ideas. But again, rhetorical discourse called into existence by the situation. Uses a nice example here of when JFK gets assassinated. It's not that people wanted to use rhetoric here. The situation demanded it. Like, they needed to do reports. They needed to go on the news, speak about this. So the situation demanded they speak. It was not the other way around. And he uses the example of if someone kind of writing fake eulogies. That eulogy isn't a rhetorical situation because it's not real. It's not affecting anything. Nothing called it into it. There's no need for it. Yeah. Let me scroll down. And again, this idea that the rhetorical situation demands a fitting response. So the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, or politicians speaking about kind of current political climates or topics, those responses are fitting specifically to the situation. If they're not going to be effective. Yeah, and again, the same idea that the response is going to fit the situation. The situation demands a fitting response. And then this idea that it needs to be real. The situation needs to be real. It's not really rhetorical if it's fictional. And thus, that'll kind of bring me into one of the questions that I'll kind of ask the group. And again, he gets into situations simple, complex, more or less organized. Kind of like a courtroom is complex and highly structured. Someone going town to town talking about abolition, it's complex, but it's loosely structured. But he doesn't get too much into that. But again, there's that idea right here that these situations, they can persist for kind of indefinitely, but they can also kind of pass. And kind of that brings us to the end, and he kind of just wraps it up. But really just want to get into kind of the connection. The real connection for me was Wardle's point about we can't create authentic tasks. Having a kid write a lab report in class that's not a science class, it's not real. It's not going to improve them. Kind of reminds me of this rhetorical situation. Like, if it's not an authentic rhetorical situation, having kids write about rhetoric, how is that going to work? It's not real. It's not rhetoric. by this logic, if it's not a rhetorical situation, it's not really rhetoric. So if I have a kid, oh, here's a rhetorical situation that's not real, is that the proper way to do it? Do I need to actually kind of establish a rhetorical situation, give them an audience that can affect change? That's kind of a tricky area. And that kind of leads into some of the questions I want to ask. One, kind of just consider what rhetorical situations did you come across today? I mean, it happens constantly. A kid got up in my class. Here's a rhetorical situation. I need to use rhetoric to do something about this. Or maybe I let it pass and I was like, I'm tired. The bell's going to ring in 2 minutes. So be it. And I would let that decay. So the situation existed whether my rhetorical response did or not. Are there holes in this concept? I did come across a couple guys who kind of disagreed that the rhetorical situation was kind of the beginning. Like they argued that there were other elements that lead into it. I only read a little bit about it, so I'm certainly not an expert to talk about it. But there were people who kind of took issue with some of what Bitzer was saying. So like, is the rhetorical situation absolute? Like, could it be modified? What do you think on that? And last, if we take this concept as it is, which I like it, how will it inform or how will it alter how we teach rhetoric? And kind of connecting back to Wardle's point, it's that idea, if we buy into this idea of the rhetorical situation, how can we use this to teach kids rhetoric? And that's kind of the tricky part. Hopefully this was useful. I was shooting for life-changing, so let me know. But I'm not holding out my hopes with that one. But you never know. So thanks, and see you in class.